My brother extended a kind and generous offer for us to live in our family home, free from the burden of rent or utility bills. As someone who works in finance and with Stephen, my husband, employed as a mechanic, this opportunity gave us a stable foundation to start building our life together. The house held immense sentimental value. It was where I grew up, and it had a rich history within our family. Originally, it served as the headquarters for my father's business, which was later passed down to my brother. My brother, who was always destined to inherit the family business, pursued an education in economics to prepare for his role. He even studied at Oxford University, gaining the knowledge and skills necessary to ensure the company's success. When he returned to New York, he joined our father, working tirelessly to grow the business. Eventually, when my parents retired and decided to move away, they handed the reins to my brother and gifted the family home to me as a gesture of love and trust. It was a perfect setup. Stephen and I moved into the house, grateful for its ideal location near public transportation, shops, hospitals, and schools. The house fit all our needs perfectly, and we imagined a bright future here, even envisioning it as a place to grow old after our children moved out. Our gratitude toward my parents was immeasurable. However, our happiness was short-lived, as peace in our home was soon disrupted. Stephen's mother began visiting frequently, her curiosity often crossing boundaries. She would ask probing questions about my parents' finances, clearly trying to gauge the extent of their wealth. Her inquiries made me uncomfortable. "Angela, how much money do your parents have?" she would ask casually, or, "What do you expect to inherit when they pass?" Her persistence forced me to develop diplomatic responses. I often told her I hadn't thought much about it and that the house was likely the full extent of any inheritance. However, she seemed skeptical, pressing on with leading questions as though trying to uncover hidden wealth. I couldn't shake the feeling that her interest stemmed from her hope of benefiting financially through me or Stephen. I decided not to share these interactions with Stephen. Knowing how close he was to his mother, I hoped to avoid unnecessary conflict. But little did I know, my silence would be followed by something far worse. One holiday morning, at precisely 7 a.m., the doorbell rang. Half asleep and expecting nothing unusual, I opened the door to find a moving truck parked outside. A man in a uniform greeted me with, "We're here to unload." Before I could process what was happening, Stephen's mother appeared, flanked by his brother's family, grinning as if this was all perfectly normal. "We're moving in," my mother-in-law announced with unnerving cheerfulness. I was stunned. Before I could utter a word, Stephen joined the scene, awakened by the commotion. He appeared entirely unbothered, as though this was an expected event. When I asked him what was going on, he merely shrugged and said, "What's the problem? There's enough space for everyone here." As if to drive home the absurdity of the situation, my sister-in-law chimed in, explaining that my brother had invited them to stay. She casually mentioned that they wouldn't be paying rent or utilities and expected our hospitality to match the house's generosity. My brother-in-law, meanwhile, was already exploring the house, deciding which room he wanted based on the sunlight. He turned to Stephen and declared, "This one will do. You'll need to move your things out." Their audacity was staggering. This was my home, yet they roamed the halls as if it were theirs to claim. My patience was wearing thin, but I tried to remain composed. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law had always been overbearing. My sister-in-law had even gone through my personal belongings in the past, and their behavior often left me feeling disrespected. But this was a new low. Summoning my courage, I finally spoke up. "This is my house," I said firmly. "You have no right to act like you own it. I'm asking you all to leave." My voice was steady, but inside, I was trembling with anger and disbelief. The sheer entitlement they displayed was overwhelming, but instead of backing down, they escalated the confrontation. "How dare you talk to us like that?" one of them snapped. "You're the one who should leave." Before I could react, I felt a sharp sting across my cheek. My mother-in-law had slapped me. I stood frozen, the pain radiating from my cheek matching the shock coursing through my body. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. When I regained my composure, I realized there was no reasoning with people like this. I refused to let them turn my home into a battleground, but I also knew I needed to remove myself from the situation to figure out my next steps. I quickly packed a few essentials and left the house, securing a short-term rental apartment. It wasn't ideal, but it gave me the breathing room I desperately needed. Once I was settled, I called my parents. Explaining the situation to them was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I could hear their outrage through the phone. My father, always a steady presence in my life, was particularly furious. While I hated burdening them with this mess, I had no choice. Their response was swift and supportive. My father, the epitome of a strong yet compassionate leader, assured me that I wasn't alone. "We'll handle this," he said, his voice calm but resolute. This was far from over. I was determined to take back my home, no matter what it took. Continued. After ending the call, I sat in silence, realizing that engaging any further would only drain my energy and accomplish nothing. I had already consulted my lawyer about potential divorce proceedings, and everything was in motion. Later that day, I noticed several missed calls from my mother-in-law and sister-in-law, but I refused to entertain them. Their incessant meddling and manipulative behavior had already caused enough harm. Without hesitation, I blocked their numbers to avoid any further disruption to my life. The looming threat of legal action and the possibility of a lawsuit proved to be too much for my husband's prideful family. They finally realized they had no legitimate claim to my home. One by one, they packed their belongings and left. Watching them go felt like a massive weight being lifted off my shoulders. With my lawyer's support, the divorce negotiations moved forward smoothly, and I was determined to reclaim the peace they had stolen from me. Once they were gone, I hired a professional cleaning service to refresh the house. It felt symbolic, like erasing their presence and restoring the sanctuary my home was meant to be. After spending months in a cramped rental apartment, nothing could compare to the comfort of returning to my own space. The house sparkled with newfound cleanliness, and the sense of peace and autonomy I felt made every struggle worthwhile. I had stood my ground, reclaimed my rights, and, most importantly, reclaimed my home. However, once I moved back in, I noticed areas of the house that required updates and repairs, things I hadn't paid much attention to before. I reached out to my father, who had always been a source of wisdom and support, and he recommended a trustworthy contractor to help with the renovations. Together, we began planning updates that marked an exciting new chapter in my life. Living alone brought a freedom that was both soothing and exhilarating. I could relax on my sofa without fear of criticism, cook and eat whatever I liked without unwanted commentary, and bask in the quiet harmony of a home that was truly mine. For the first time in years, I felt at ease. But my tranquility was disrupted unexpectedly. About 5 months after embracing my newfound solitude, I began receiving repeated calls from an unknown number. At first, I assumed it was the contractor or a delivery service and ignored them. Yet the calls persisted, day after day, until curiosity got the better of me. When I finally answered, I was shocked to hear my ex-husband's voice. "Stephen." His audacity left me momentarily speechless. We had agreed, through our lawyers, to cease all contact after the divorce. For him to reach out now, breaking that agreement, was a clear violation of our terms. "Why are you calling me? We agreed to never contact each other again," I demanded, my voice sharp with irritation. Ignoring my questions, he began speaking rapidly, his tone desperate. He painted a grim picture of his current circumstances, explaining that his company was in financial turmoil and had cut his salary drastically. His mother's health had taken a turn for the worse, leaving her unable to work, and his sister-in-law and her husband were struggling financially due to mounting debts and unstable jobs. His voice cracked as he pleaded with me to understand their plight. "We're in serious trouble. We might not even have enough to pay rent or buy food tomorrow. We used to be a family, right? Please, help us," he begged. I listened, but his words stirred no sympathy within me. My memories of them barging into my home uninvited, treating me with disdain, and even attempting to push me out were still vivid. Their actions, so filled with entitlement and disrespect, left no room for compassion in my heart. "I'm sorry, but your difficulties are not my responsibility," I replied firmly. "We had an agreement. Stephen, do not contact me again." He tried to persist, but I cut him off. "I've made my position clear. Goodbye." With that, I ended the call and blocked his new number. As I sat down, a wave of disbelief washed over me. How could people who had treated me so poorly now expect me to help them? I reflected on all the hardships I had endured during our marriage. My mother-in-law had not only been overbearing but outright cruel, constantly meddling in our lives and spreading harmful rumors about me. My sister-in-law and brother-in-law had mocked me, ridiculed my traditional values, and shown no respect for my personal space. The memories of their behavior only solidified my resolve. I would not allow them to manipulate me into their chaos again. The following weekend, I made arrangements to change my phone number to avoid further harassment. However, before I could implement this plan, they crossed another line. At around 10 p.m., one night, I was startled by loud banging on my front door. Their voices echoed through the quiet neighborhood. "Open up, let us in, you should help us, we're family," they shouted, completely disregarding the late hour. Rather than open the door, I spoke to them through the intercom. "Please leave, this is not appropriate, you're disturbing the neighbors," I said firmly. But they ignored me and continued banging on the door, creating an even bigger scene. I was on the verge of calling the police when I heard sirens in the distance. Unbeknownst to me, one of my neighbors had already called the authorities. As the police arrived, Stephen and his family panicked, mistakenly assuming I had called the police. They attempted to flee, but the crowd of onlookers and the officer's swift response made escape impossible. The police escorted them to the station, and I provided a detailed account of the events. Their unwarranted intrusion and reckless behavior shocked the neighborhood, and word quickly spread, even reaching Stephen's workplace. The incident was the final blow to Stephen's already precarious professional situation. His employer decided to terminate him, citing the public ordeal as damaging to their reputation. With no job and mounting financial struggles, Stephen and his family faced a complete collapse. Ultimately, they were forced to move into public housing, with Stephen and his mother taking on multiple part-time jobs to make ends meet. Even his once prideful mother had to work, a far cry from her days of meddling in my life. As for me, I finally had the peace and closure I needed. My boundaries were firm, my home was mine again, and my life was free from their toxic influence.